Hi, welcome to week 2 of Gen Ed 53 Overview of Addiction. I wanted to put a little video up just talking a little bit about week 1's PASS module and specifically about the Biopsychosocial Plus model. It's an interesting model and concept and something that I use every day in my Monday to Friday job as an addictions counselor. One of the things that I do in that job is I provide individual counseling as well as group therapy and counseling for individuals struggling with addiction, and that could be addiction to substances or other behaviors such as gambling, sex, relationships. The Biopsychosocial Plus model is a way in which we look at examining some of the causation around addiction. So when we break that down, we've got 5 key dimensions in the BPS Plus model. We have the biological, we have the psychological, the social, spiritual, and cultural. And when we look at those dimensions, we look at it from a standpoint of how the dimensions interact with somebody's life and some of the factors which contribute to addiction. And so as you're getting into week 2, you're going to see a video of an interview of Gabor Mate, and he's going to talk a little bit about some of these interactions. And so that first piece, in the biological piece, we look at factors that are we look at the neurobiology, possible genetic factors, and things like that. And we kind of look at how those elements play into addiction. And then in the second dimension there, we have the psychological piece. And the psychological piece it's an area where we start to look at the mind. We look at motivation, reward, and that kind of stuff, and how that interacts with each other. And then in the social dimension, we look at social interactions. I'm sure people have probably heard the saying, you are who your friends are. And as some of you may even have, you may have said that yourself, or you may have had parents who have said that to you. And there may be some truth to this, but what's interesting about those 3 dimensions are that they interact with one another, and it's not that it's any one factor. And one of the ways in which I say this is you might know this for yourself, is that there may be people who are in this course who have struggled with addiction. There may be people in this course who have family members who have struggled with addiction, or may have friends, in their close group of friends that have struggled with addiction. And what's interesting about that, so let's look at the social. If we look at that social dimension, if we purely looked at it from a social standpoint, that would mean, kind of we are what our social circles are. And though there may be some relevance to this, it doesn't stand up in the face of, of pure scrutiny. And what I mean by that is, if we were to look at everybody that hung out in the same social circles, they wouldn't always have the same struggles. There may be people, as I was talking about, the very same people that are taking this course, you may know this for yourself, is that you may not struggle with addiction at all, or in the same way that maybe a friend in your peer group does. Having said that, some people may, and so we see that the social dimension can be important, but we don't want to put all of our emphasis on one dimension like social. Same as biological, right? We may know that there are two siblings can come from the same parents, and let's say the parents struggle with addiction themselves, and there's a lot of research that goes into looking at whether or not addiction is genetic. And I know they've struggled to come up with a specific, and you're going to hear Gabor Mate talk about this, that there isn't specific research that says, yes, here's the DNA evidence and here is the genetic coding for addiction. But what you will hear is that it's a part of it can sometimes be a part of that process. And so what we see is that genetics can lend itself, but you could have 2 siblings from the same family, and one struggles with addiction and one doesn't. So if we were to look at it from that standpoint, then we would have to say it's not purely genetic, nor is it purely your social environment. And then, if we were to look at the psychological dimension, it's also not purely psychological. Now, when we look at those other 2 dimensions, and they were added, so originally the BPS Plus model was just the biopsychosocial model. It had those 3 main dimensions. And then over time, the research has slowly added, and what we know now is that when we look at cultural and spiritual, these are two important dimensions as well. When we look at culture is very similar to our social, in that I like to break it down into both. There's a micro and a macro. So if we look at it micro and macro from the social standpoint, what we see is, on a micro level, you've got kind of your nuclear family, your close friends, maybe the kind of that close circle in your life. Now, if we were to zoom out a little bit on a broader level for social, we also have kind of your neighborhood. It could be your community, your city, and your school, things like that. More of a zoomed out kind of macro approach. When we look at cultural, we see it in the same way. We see, on a micro level, we look at kind of our immediate culture around us, but then on a macro level, we also look at a global context. And that, if we were to decide that addiction is based on what we maybe in our, from a Canadian perspective, and say if everybody operates outside of what we believe the norm is for here in Canada. For instance, we're going to talk a little bit over the course about, and one of the things we'll talk about is something called low restricting guidelines that have been developed here in Canada. And those guidelines might fit us culturally, but when we go to another culture, it may be completely different. Or we have some cultures around the world that alcohol isn't even prevalent at all, and that aren't even a piece of the community and in that cultural context. So when we look at it, we have the micro cultural piece, which is a very smaller scale, and then we have the macro, more of a global piece. And then the last dimension, spiritual. And when we look at the spiritual dimension, it both encompasses religion, and the religious and the non-religious. Often when we hear spiritual, we think maybe organized religion, things like that. And though that could be a piece of spirituality in its broadest context is a connection to our innermost self and something greater than ourselves. And so again, how that dimension interacts with addiction is that what we find is when people don't have a connection to themselves and a connection to something greater than themselves, something outside of themselves, even connected to kind of this, our own world or things in our world, in our universe, then what happens is we sometimes feel, I see people all the time who come in and they lack a spiritual component in their life, and they lack that connection to themselves and to something greater than themselves. And so when we don't feel like we're a part of something greater, often that can be another component to addiction. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that and explain it from the perspective that I use. And so when I have somebody, say, come into my office for the first time, I might start examining those dimensions and talk to people about those dimensions, find out, I'll get a sense of what the familial background of somebody is in terms of addiction. I'll talk about the psychological component and kind of find out how people psychologically are working, what kind of motivates them, what reward systems they have, those kind of things that they've developed on their own. And I'll also look at their social setting and how that's possibly contributed to their situation. The one thing I think that's really important when we look at the BPS Plus model is that it's non-reductive in nature. And what I mean by that is it would be easy for us to say, or not easy, but it would be nice if we could say, it's this specific thing. This is what causes and leads to addiction. But with the BPS Plus model, what we see is that there is 5 dimensions, and inside those dimensions there's all these little components and pieces of the dimension. And it's actually almost always, when we look at addiction, we look at it from the standpoint of a multifaceted approach, and we look at it, and that's that piece where I say it's non-reductive. It'd be like me telling you guys that, I have this blue shirt on, and I like to wear blue shirts, and for people then to just kind of reduce me down to a guy that wears blue shirts. And I know that seems like an extreme example in this case, but if that was kind of the thing that defined me, and people reduced me down to one feature about shirt that I was wearing today, for instance, then that's a very small piece of who I am, right? Because I might wear a red shirt tomorrow, and then that's going to blow that theory right out of the water that I solely am a person who wears blue shirts. And so again, we just as we don't reduce people down to say one article of clothing that they wear or a way in which they talk, we don't reduce addiction down to well, your mother struggled with addiction, so therefore that must be why you struggle with addiction. Because that would be a reductive approach, and that's not helpful in this. Partly because when we look at addiction and the makeup of it, and when we look at causation, it's actually complex, and it may even be different for person A than it is for person B. And we see that it doesn't necessarily always follow one pattern. And it would be nice if it did, but if it did, then I would be very successful at my job, and I would be going on tour, and I'd be curing the world of addiction, because it would be very specific, and I could say, here's the problem, here's the cure. And so hopefully when we go through this course, a large piece of what's going to happen, especially on our discussion forums and our assignments, is that we're going to be open to the possibilities. We all come with our own bias. If I just had an in-class discussion today, because I also teach the same course in class at the college and on the Kingston campus on Tuesdays. We had a discussion about what comes to mind when we ask people, when I mention the word addiction. We had all kinds of things pop up as we talked about addiction. And so what we want to do is we want to broaden our scope. All of us right now have a specific understanding of that, and we may be open to expanding that. And what I'm going to do is challenge you over this course, hopefully, to broaden and expand your view of addiction. And I think that that'll help sometimes to conceptualize what it is we're talking about as we go forward. Because if we just have this one very specific, narrow definition, it'll create problems as we go, because there's always going to be people that fall outside of the specific, narrow definition that I would like addiction to fall under. And really, that becomes something that's convenient about us, and creating this convenient box that we can fit people in. So hopefully that was helpful, a helpful explanation of the biopsychosocial plus model.